Riverside Park sprawled across the heart of the city, a tranquil oasis amidst the cacophony of urban life. As the late afternoon sun bathed the landscape in a golden hue, the park teemed with life. Laughter echoed through the air as children chased each other on the grassy knolls, their joy infectious, while couples strolled hand in hand along winding paths. The gentle rustle of leaves danced in harmony with the distant sound of a splashing fountain, creating a symphony of peace that enveloped all who entered this sanctuary. For Marcus Davis, this park was more than just a beautiful spot. It was his retreat from the daily grind, a place where he could momentarily escape the pressures of his demanding job and immerse himself in the pages of a book. Marcus sat on a weathered wooden bench, completely engrossed in his novel, the world around him fading away. He was a composed and intelligent black man, his presence exuding a quiet confidence that belied the storm of societal expectations swirling outside the park's boundaries. With each turn of the page, he found solace, the words transporting him to different worlds, far removed from the harsh realities that often colored his experiences. Here, under the warm embrace of the sun, he felt a sense of belonging, an illusion of safety where he could simply be himself without the weight of judgment pressing down on his shoulders. However, not far from this peaceful scene, Officer Brian Harkins made his rounds through the park, his keen eyes scanning the surroundings with a practiced intensity honed over 2 decades of service. A seasoned police officer, Brian prided himself on his ability to read people and situations, trusting his instincts to guide him in maintaining order. But today, as he patrolled the path, something caught his attention. His gaze landed on Marcus, who sat alone, seemingly too calm and composed. An inexplicable unease stirred within him, a feeling he had learned to trust throughout his career. As he drew closer, Brian's mind began to conjure doubts, fed by the subtle whispers of his internal biases. Despite Marcus's serene demeanor, the mere sight of a black man sitting alone sparked a nagging suspicion in Brian's gut. He had seen reports of a suspect fitting a vague description in the area, and the thought began to take root. The assumptions piled up, leading him to an unfounded conclusion that Marcus might be involved in something nefarious. Unbeknownst to Brian, his perceptions were warped by societal stereotypes and prejudices, clouding his judgment and steering him towards a confrontation that would unfold in the moments to come. In this moment, the serene atmosphere of Riverside Park hung precariously in the balance, unaware that the peaceful sanctuary was about to be disrupted by the clash of unwarranted suspicion and an unwavering quest for understanding. As Officer Brian Harkins continued his patrol through Riverside Park, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He watched Marcus Davis from a distance, taking in every detail, the way Marcus sat on the weathered bench, the book resting casually on his lap, and the calm expression that played across his face. But as Brian focused on Marcus, his observations began to morph into prejudiced assumptions, clouding his judgment with every passing moment. In Brian's mind, a black man sitting alone in a park stirred an inexplicable unease, a gut feeling he had been conditioned to trust over his years on the force. The fact that Marcus appeared too calm, too composed for someone who should be out and about, raised red flags. Brian recalled the vague reports of a suspect fitting a general description, a tall black male. It was a flimsy connection, one built on nothing more than stereotypes and biases that had festered within him over the years, yet it felt all too real in that moment. His heart raced as he considered his next steps. Should I approach him? The question lingered in his mind, but an internal struggle ensued. He wrestled with the reluctance to engage, knowing all too well the accusations that could fly if he acted out of line. But the thought of a possible criminal lurking in plain sight made it difficult for him to ignore his instincts. It was a conflict that left him tense and uncertain, an uneasy mix of authority and unwarranted fear. Across the park, Marcus was keenly aware of the scrutiny directed at him. As he turned a page in his book, he felt the weight of someone's gaze piercing through the serene ambience. He had lived through countless encounters like this before and recognized the signs of someone watching him with suspicion. With a practiced calm, Marcus maintained his composure, allowing the officer's unease to wash over him like water off a duck's back. He knew this moment was inevitable, It was simply part of navigating the world as a black man. As Officer Harkins approached, Marcus kept his expression neutral, but inside, he prepared himself for the encounter. He understood the stakes. He could either escalate the situation or remain steady and firm, ensuring that he would not be provoked into a reaction that could worsen the officer's suspicions. "Afternoon," Brian greeted as he reached the bench, his tone polite but edged with an underlying tension. He towered over Marcus, an imposing figure designed to instill a sense of authority. "Afternoon," Marcus replied, his voice calm and even. He didn't flinch under the officer's scrutiny, choosing instead to maintain eye contact, subtly asserting his presence in the face of adversity. "What brings you out here today?" Brian asked, his eyes scanning Marcus's face as if searching for any hint of guilt. The question was loaded, revealing his preconceived notions that already painted Marcus as a suspect rather than a mere park-goer. "Just enjoying the park," Marcus responded, his tone steady and composed. "It's a nice day." Brian nodded slowly, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the narrative that would justify his suspicions. "You from around here?" he pressed, hoping to dig deeper into what he perceived as evasiveness. Marcus offered a slight smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "I've been around. It's a good place to clear my head," he said, aware that his vague answers were fueling the officer's growing suspicion. The tension thickened as Brian shifted his weight, adopting a more confrontational stance. "Mind if I see some ID?" he demanded, his hand subtly moving closer to his holster, a threat concealed behind a veneer of authority. Marcus felt a surge of frustration but pushed it down. "Am I under arrest?" he asked, his tone measured, refusing to let the officer intimidate him. Brian bristled at the question, his expression tightening. "You will be if you don't cooperate," he shot back, a flicker of anger evident in his eyes. With a slow breath, Marcus decided to comply, knowing that pushing back could escalate the situation further. He reached into his pocket and retrieved his wallet, all the while maintaining eye contact with Brian, aware that the officer's grip on his baton was tightening. As he handed over his ID, Marcus watched the officer snatch it from his hand, noting the subtle shift in Brian's demeanor. There was a flicker of doubt hidden beneath the surface, a hint of uncertainty that Marcus could sense. Yet, Brian clung tightly to his assumptions, unwilling to acknowledge the discomfort brewing inside him. "Stand up," Brian ordered, stepping back to give Marcus space. The words hung heavily in the air, and Marcus sighed inwardly, but he complied, rising slowly from the bench. With his hands visible and his demeanor calm, he turned around as Brian pulled out a pair of handcuffs. This was the moment where tension could erupt or be defused, and Marcus chose to remain composed. He could feel the eyes of park-goers on him, their stares a mix of curiosity and apprehension, but he wouldn't let their judgment dictate his reaction. As Brian cuffed him, an unsettling sense of weariness washed over Marcus. He had been subjected to this kind of treatment before, and while he understood the systemic issues at play, the exhaustion of it all threatened to overwhelm him. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice steady despite the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," Brian said, though even he could hear the weakness in his justification. As they walked towards the patrol car, Marcus remained silent, his mind racing with thoughts of how a simple afternoon in the park had taken such a turn. This encounter was not just a moment of racial profiling. It was a reflection of the societal biases that persistently shadowed him, regardless of his identity or accomplishments. Marcus felt the weight of the world pressing down on him as they approached the patrol car, but deep down, he was determined not to allow the assumptions of a single officer to define him. He would stand firm in the face of adversity, refusing to be just another statistic in a long history of injustice. As Officer Brian Harkins stood towering over Marcus Davis, the atmosphere crackled with tension. Brian's eyes narrowed, and he demanded, "Mind if I see some ID?" His voice held an edge, a mix of authority and suspicion, as he scanned Marcus's face for any sign of defiance. The question hung in the air, heavy and charged, while Marcus felt the weight of judgment bearing down upon him. In that moment, Marcus experienced a whirlwind of emotions. He recognized the demand for ID as a crucial turning point, knowing that how he responded could either defuse or escalate the situation. The air was thick with anticipation, and he could feel the eyes of nearby parkgoers drifting toward them, sensing the unfolding drama. Would his refusal to show ID provoke a confrontation? Would it lead to a situation he had desperately sought to avoid? He took a steadying breath, reminding himself of his rights, but the stakes felt painfully high. His mind raced as he weighed the consequences of compliance against the risks of resistance. He had been in this position before, confronted by authority figures who operated on preconceived notions of guilt based on nothing more than the color of his skin. Yet, he also understood that today's encounter had the potential to escalate into something far more dangerous if he didn't navigate it carefully. With a calm demeanor, Marcus met Brian's gaze, choosing his words with precision. "Am I under arrest?" he asked, his tone measured, signaling that he would not be intimidated. He felt the tension tighten around them like a noose, each moment pregnant with possibility. Brian bristled at the question, his jaw tightening. "You will be if you don't cooperate," he shot back, anger creeping into his voice as his hand instinctively rested on his holster. Marcus could feel the frustration bubbling within him, but he recognized the officer's aggression as a reflection of his own biases, not a justification for his actions. Instead of letting anger take control, he opted for a moment of calculated compliance, hoping it would bring some resolution to the encounter. "I'll show you my ID," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. He reached slowly into his pocket, careful to make each movement deliberate and non-threatening. The sound of his wallet being pulled out felt like a countdown to an impending explosion, the air around them thickening with uncertainty. As he handed his ID to Brian, he kept his expression neutral, aware that every nuance mattered. Brian snatched the ID from Marcus's hand, his grip firm and almost aggressive. "Stand up," he ordered, stepping back slightly to create space. Marcus's heart sank, knowing what was coming next but unwilling to show fear. He stood slowly, maintaining eye contact with Brian, determined to assert his dignity in this moment. Then came the moment that sent a surge of frustration coursing through Marcus. As Brian pulled out a pair of handcuffs, the cold metal felt like an embodiment of his weariness. The act of being restrained, even temporarily, ignited a mixture of anger and exhaustion deep within him. It was a reminder of how society often judged him by the color of his skin, reducing his identity to mere suspicion. As Brian secured the cuffs around Marcus's wrists, the world around them blurred into a backdrop of muffled gasps and whispered comments from bystanders. They stood as witnesses, their reactions a tapestry of surprise, concern, and discomfort. Some stared in disbelief, while others quickly averted their eyes, unable to bear the sight of injustice unfolding before them. Marcus could sense their gazes piercing through him, each look a silent question, "Why is this happening?" He felt the weight of their scrutiny, a collective witnessing of an encounter that should never have escalated to this point. The frustrations boiled within him, not only for himself but for every person of color who had ever faced a similar indignity. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but laced with palpable frustration, a stark contrast to the turmoil churning inside him. He fought against the urge to react with anger, knowing that such a response could worsen the situation. Brian, now caught in a web of his own making, felt a flicker of doubt but refused to show it. He averted his eyes, attempting to regain control over the narrative he had created. As he led Marcus toward the patrol car, the cuffs biting into Marcus's wrists, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. This moment was about more than just a confrontation between a police officer and a man sitting in a park. It was emblematic of a much larger issue, a society rife with prejudices that allowed fear and bias to dictate actions. Marcus could feel the weight of that reality pressing down on him as they walked, but he held his head high, determined to remind the world that he was more than just a victim of circumstance. Inside the patrol car, the cold metal of the seat was a stark reminder of how quickly the balance of power could shift. As the engine roared to life, Marcus looked out the window, the park receding into the background. He realized that this encounter was not just another instance of prejudice, but also a critical juncture, a moment that could potentially spark a larger conversation about justice, race, and the responsibilities of those in power. Despite the deep weariness that enveloped him, Marcus felt a flicker of resolve igniting within. The road ahead might be fraught with challenges, but he was prepared to navigate it. In the face of adversity, he would not be silenced. Instead, he would stand tall, ready to confront whatever came next, knowing that the truth would eventually emerge from the shadows of bias and assumption. The interior of the patrol car felt stifling, the air thick with unspoken tension as Officer Brian Harkins gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the dark leather. The sound of the engine hummed in the background, but the silence between him and Marcus Davis was deafening. As they drove through the city streets, the familiar sights blurred past: shops, pedestrians, and children playing in parks, each passing moment a reminder of the normalcy Marcus was being denied. Brian's mind was a whirlpool of conflicting thoughts. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had overstepped, that something about this arrest felt wrong. Yet pride held him captive, refusing to let him admit fault. He had been patrolling these streets for over 2 decades, and every instinct he had honed told him he was right. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror at Marcus, whose calm demeanor only served to heighten his unease, doubt crept in like a shadow. In the back seat, Marcus sat with his hands cuffed behind him, the cold metal a stark reminder of the unjust circumstances he found himself in. His mind raced, reflecting on the systemic racism that permeated society, particularly in law enforcement. This wasn't just about him. It was a manifestation of deep-rooted biases that reduced people like him to mere suspects based on the color of their skin. He took a deep breath, centering himself in the moment. Despite the oppressive weight of the situation, Marcus maintained his composure. He thought about his career, the dedication he had poured into his work, and how quickly that could be disregarded in favor of stereotypes. He had earned his place, and yet here he was, subjected to the whims of a prejudiced officer. Keeping his calm exterior was essential. It was a subtle act of defiance against the unfairness he faced. "Where did you say you were from again?" Brian's voice broke the silence, tinged with a defensive edge. His gaze remained focused on the road ahead, but the question hung in the air, revealing his desire to justify his actions. "I didn't," Marcus replied evenly, aware of the undertones in Brian's inquiry. "But does it matter where I'm from? I was simply enjoying a book in the park." Brian's grip tightened on the steering wheel, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Just a little unusual to see someone like you in that park," he muttered, the insinuation unmistakable. "What do you mean by someone like me?" Marcus countered, keeping his voice calm. He knew the conversation was teetering on the edge of confrontation, but he wanted to challenge Brian's assumptions without provoking further hostility. Brian shot him a quick glance, defensiveness flaring up. "You know what I mean," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No, I really don't," Marcus pressed, maintaining eye contact through the mirror. "What does my presence have to do with your suspicions? People come from all backgrounds to enjoy public spaces. Why should I be treated differently?" Brian's jaw clenched, his frustration palpable. "I was just doing my job, man. We get calls about suspicious behavior, and Suspicious behavior?" Marcus interrupted gently. "I was reading." "Why is reading in a park suspicious? Is it because of the color of my skin?" The tension in the car escalated, and Brian hesitated, grappling with the weight of Marcus's words. "Look, I didn't mean it like that," he stammered, his defensiveness betraying him. "But it's my job to be cautious." "Caution is one thing," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "Racial profiling is another. You approached me because I didn't fit your idea of who belongs in that park. That's not being cautious, that's prejudice." Silence enveloped the car once more as Brian's heart raced. He hadn't anticipated this kind of dialogue. The truth of Marcus's accusations cut deep, forcing him to confront his biases, but his pride and stubbornness made it difficult to accept. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the conversation. "You don't understand the pressures we face out here. It's not always black and white," he said, the weariness in his tone betraying his internal struggle. "Maybe not," Marcus replied, maintaining his composure. "But it shouldn't be an excuse for unjust treatment. You have a responsibility to serve and protect, not to judge based on appearances." Brian glanced in the rearview mirror again, caught off guard by the depth of Marcus's insight. The man he had arrested was not just a suspect. He was a well-spoken, intelligent individual who was challenging his preconceived notions in a way that was disarming. Brian faltered, searching for the right words to justify his actions. "I just saw you sitting there, and it felt wrong, like you didn't belong." "Yet you've never seen me before," Marcus pointed out, raising an eyebrow. "How can you determine my worth or right to be there based on a fleeting moment?" "That's the issue at hand, officer. It's not just about this encounter. It's about how people like you are trained to see people like me." The implications of Marcus's words lingered in the air, heavy with the gravity of the systemic issues they hinted at. Brian felt the walls of his understanding crumbling, replaced by the stark realization that he was perpetuating a cycle of bias and injustice. As the patrol car pulled into the precinct parking lot, the weight of their conversation hung between them, a fragile bridge of understanding built amidst an atmosphere fraught with tension. Brian turned off the engine, the silence thick with anticipation of what lay ahead. The ride had been more than just a journey to a destination. It was a reckoning, a confrontation with the uncomfortable truths that shaped their realities. Marcus took a deep breath, ready to face whatever challenges awaited him inside, knowing that change often began with difficult conversations. Meanwhile, Brian grappled with the knowledge that today's encounter had shifted something deep within him, compelling him to reconsider not only his actions but also the role he played in a much larger system. As the patrol car rolled into the precinct's parking lot, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The moment they stepped inside, Marcus Davis was struck by the stark contrast between the hustle and bustle of the precinct and the tense situation he found himself in. Officers moved purposefully, their voices mingling with the ringing of phones and the clatter of paperwork being processed. Some were deep in conversation, others filing reports, and a few engaged in light banter that seemed to echo through the high ceilings, creating an almost chaotic symphony of law enforcement activity. Marcus felt acutely aware of his surroundings as Officer Brian Harkins led him through the narrow hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, illuminating the stern faces of his fellow officers. Each glance thrown in their direction felt heavy, laden with unspoken judgments and curiosity. Some officers paused mid-conversation, their brows furrowed in confusion, while others exchanged knowing looks, clearly questioning why Marcus was being escorted in handcuffs. Brian's discomfort was palpable. He walked with a stiffness in his posture, the weight of their scrutinizing gazes pressing down on him like a thick fog. As they entered the booking area, the contrast became even more pronounced. The area was a hive of activity, with officers processing paperwork, inmates waiting in line, and detectives discussing cases in low voices. The hum of conversation was punctuated by the sound of printers whirring and keyboards clacking, all of which stood in stark contrast to Marcus's tense silence. He could feel the eyes of the officers boring into him, each glance a reminder of the assumptions that had led to this moment. "Stand by the desk," Brian instructed, his voice lacking the authority he usually commanded. Marcus complied, standing tall despite the handcuffs that bit into his wrists, reminding himself that he had done nothing wrong. He could sense Brian's reluctance as they approached Officer Jenkins, a young officer behind the processing desk who looked up in surprise upon their arrival. "Hey, Brian. What's going on?" Jenkins asked, his brow furrowing as he glanced between Brian and Marcus. The familiar banter between them was replaced by a tense atmosphere, underscored by the realization that something was off. Brian hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "Caught this guy in the park," he muttered, his tone clipped, as if he were unwilling to fully acknowledge the situation. He handed Marcus's ID to Jenkins, who examined it closely. As Jenkins looked at the ID, a flicker of recognition crossed his face, but he quickly masked it. Marcus noted the brief hesitation, storing it away in his mind. Whatever assumptions Jenkins had about him, they would soon come to light. "What's the charge?" Jenkins asked, his eyes narrowing as he began typing into the computer. Brian shifted uncomfortably, his expression taut. There was a report about a suspicious person in the park. He matched a description, and I asked for ID, but he didn't cooperate, Brian explained, the words sounding weak even to his own ears. He could feel the skepticism radiating from Jenkins and the other officers nearby. "Did you find anything on him?" Jenkins inquired, still focused on the screen. The tension hung heavy in the air as Brian fumbled for an answer. "No," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Jenkins raised an eyebrow, looking from the ID back to Marcus. "So, you arrested him for just sitting in a park?" The incredulity in his voice was unmistakable, and Marcus couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. If there was any indication that the precinct recognized the absurdity of the situation, it lay in Jenkins's expression. Before Brian could respond, Captain Laura Bennett entered the booking area. Her presence commanded immediate attention. Her reputation as a competent and no-nonsense officer preceded her. She scanned the room, her sharp eyes landing on the trio at the desk. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice firm as she approached. Brian felt a surge of anxiety at her arrival, knowing she would expect a clear explanation for the situation. "Captain," Brian said, standing a little taller, though his voice trembled slightly, "I brought in this man, Marcus Davis, on suspicion of suspicious activity in the park." Bennett's gaze flickered to Marcus, a slight narrowing of her eyes revealing her interest in the situation. "Did you have a valid reason for the arrest?" she asked, her tone unwavering. Brian hesitated, the pressure mounting as he struggled to justify his actions. He matched a description we had." Bennett's expression shifted, a mixture of disappointment and concern crossing her face. "A description? And did you find any evidence of wrongdoing?" "No," Brian admitted, the admission tasting bitter. The scrutiny from Bennett and the other officers felt like a spotlight shining down on him, exposing his every flaw. "Then we have a problem," Bennett replied, her voice steady, but with an underlying sense of urgency. "Officer Harkins, we need to handle this properly. You know the importance of upholding the law, not just enforcing it." Marcus watched as the tension thickened, feeling a sense of respect for Bennett. She embodied the professionalism he had hoped to find in law enforcement. In this moment, it was clear that she was committed to ensuring justice, not only for him but for the integrity of the department as well. As she continued to question Brian about the specifics of the arrest, Marcus felt a swell of hope. Perhaps this encounter could lead to meaningful change within the department, and in the broader society he had long fought against. In the stark, fluorescent-lit room of the precinct, Captain Laura Bennett sat across from Officer Brian Harkins, her demeanor unyielding as she prepared to address the events that had transpired in Riverside Park. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and the weight of the situation bore down heavily on Brian as he shifted uneasily in his seat. Bennett, with her sharp eyes and no-nonsense approach, had a reputation for demanding the truth, and today would be no exception. "Officer Harkins," she began, her voice steady and authoritative, "I need you to walk me through the circumstances that led to the arrest of Mr. Marcus Davis." Brian swallowed hard, feeling the scrutiny of her gaze as she leaned forward, her fingers steepled in front of her. "I saw him in the park," he started, but even he could sense how flimsy his explanation sounded. "He fit the description of a suspect we've been looking for. Tall black male, early 40s. And what exactly was suspicious about his behavior?" Bennett pressed, her tone firm but devoid of judgment, though the weight of her expectations was clear. Brian hesitated, scrambling for a justification. He was sitting alone, reading a book. I had a gut feeling." Bennett raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "A gut feeling? Did that feeling include the fact that he was unarmed and doing nothing illegal?" Brian shifted in his seat, his anxiety spiking. The implications of his actions began to unfurl in his mind, wrapping around him like a noose. He realized the gravity of what he had done, the profiling, the unwarranted assumptions, the arrest of an innocent man based solely on his race. "I didn't mean to. I just thought." Bennett cut him off, her voice rising slightly with authority. "You thought what? That a black man in a park must be up to no good? That's not how we operate here, Brian. You know that." The tension in the room escalated as Brian felt his heart race. Each word from Bennett felt like a hammer striking the nail of his incompetence further into the wood. "I was just trying to do my job," he murmured, but even he could hear the weakness in his defense. "Your job?" Bennett echoed, incredulous. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to profile and assume. You had no probable cause to detain Mr. Davis. No evidence, just a flawed assumption based on race." The weight of her words pressed down on Brian like a lead blanket, and for the first time, he questioned his own judgment. The severity of the consequences began to sink in as he thought about the ramifications not just for himself, but for the precinct and the community. "I didn't think it would escalate like this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in the adjacent room, awaiting the outcome of the interrogation. The walls felt like they were closing in, but he remained composed, reflecting on the systemic issues within law enforcement that had led to this moment. His thoughts swirled around the recurring theme of racial profiling and the biases that permeated the very fabric of society. He understood all too well that his identity as an FBI agent would likely remain undisclosed in this situation, and he was resolute in ensuring accountability. This moment, he realized, could serve as a catalyst for change within the department. It was an opportunity to confront the systemic injustices that had long plagued law enforcement, to shed light on the biases that clouded judgment. Marcus felt a surge of determination. He knew he had to see this through. As Bennett continued her questioning, her focus sharpened on the specifics of Brian's actions. "You approached Mr. Davis, demanding his ID, and when he didn't comply immediately, you arrested him. What was your justification for that?" Brian's pulse quickened at the direct confrontation. The stakes felt impossibly high, and he struggled to maintain his composure. "I thought he was hiding something," he said, but the conviction behind his words waned as he spoke. "Did it occur to you that a man simply enjoying a book in the park was not doing anything wrong?" Bennett asked, her voice cutting through his defenses. "Your job is not to act as judge and jury based on the color of someone's skin." The tension in the room reached a boiling point. Marcus, still waiting, could almost feel the crackling energy of the confrontation through the thin walls. His heart raced with the knowledge of what was at stake, not just for him, but for countless others who had faced similar injustices. Bennett's eyes narrowed as she leaned closer to Brian. "This isn't just about your actions today. It's about the mindset that led you here. You have a responsibility to hold yourself and your colleagues accountable. Do you understand that?" Brian nodded slowly, the weight of his realization settling heavily on his shoulders. "I understand, Captain. But I didn't mean for it to go this far." "But it did, Officer Harkins," she replied, her voice resolute. "It did." The gravity of the situation loomed large as the interrogation continued, with Marcus's presence hanging silently in the balance, waiting for justice to unfold. Captain Laura Bennett sat back in her chair, contemplating the situation before her. The evidence was overwhelming, and the ramifications of Officer Brian Harkins's actions loomed large over the precinct. As she reviewed the details, a flicker of recognition sparked in her mind when she thought about Marcus Davis. She had seen his name on reports before, an FBI agent with an impressive record, known for his commitment to justice and community engagement. The implications of this revelation were profound, not just for Marcus, but for Brian's career as well. "Brian," she began, her tone firm yet measured, "there's something you need to know." Brian looked up, his expression tense, the air thick with apprehension. "The man you arrested, Marcus Davis, is not just a civilian. He's an FBI agent." The impact of her words hit Brian like a freight train. He stared at her, disbelief washing over his features as the realization sunk in. "What? Are you serious?" he stammered, his mind racing to comprehend the situation. "Yes," Bennett confirmed, her gaze unwavering. "He's a special agent with the Bureau, and his identity is significant, particularly considering the circumstances surrounding your actions today." As the weight of this new information settled over him, Brian's heart raced, and his stomach twisted in knots. He had profiled a federal agent, someone who held authority and credibility far beyond his own. The realization cascaded through him like a wave, bringing with it a tide of regret. He felt the remnants of his previous arrogance crumble under the scrutiny of the truth, exposing the biases he had long tried to ignore. "Think about what that means, Brian," Bennett continued, her voice steady but stern. "You made assumptions based on his appearance, assumptions that have led to serious consequences not only for him but for yourself as well." Brian's mind reeled as he reflected on the chain of events that had led him here. The assumptions he had made, the prejudices that had clouded his judgment, were now glaringly evident, each one a misstep that had culminated in this disastrous encounter. It was a hard truth to swallow, and he struggled to find the words. "I didn't know, I didn't realize." "That's precisely the problem," Bennett interjected, her tone sharp. "You didn't take the time to understand who he was before you acted. You let your biases dictate your actions." With a heavy heart, she reached for a file on her desk. "Given the severity of this situation and the implications of your actions, I'm placing you on temporary leave pending an investigation." The words hung in the air like a thick fog, and Brian felt his chest tighten. The fear of losing his badge, the career he had devoted over 2 decades to, washed over him. "Captain, please," he began, desperation creeping into his voice. Bennett held up a hand, her expression resolute. "This isn't just about you, Brian. This is about ensuring that the standards of this department are upheld. We can't afford to have officers who act on prejudiced assumptions. It undermines the trust we're supposed to build with the community we serve." As Bennett spoke, Brian felt a mix of emotions swirl within him: fear, regret, and a dawning awareness of the biases that had guided his actions. He looked down at the desk, his mind flooded with memories of his career, the pride he had felt in upholding the law, the times he believed he had made a difference. But now all he could see were the cracks in that facade, the ways in which he had failed, not just himself, but the very community he had sworn to protect. "I understand," Brian finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, the weight of his mistakes settling heavily on his shoulders. He felt defeated, yet somewhere deep down, a flicker of hope began to emerge, a hope that perhaps this could be a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire department. Bennett nodded, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "Use this time to reflect on what you've learned today, and understand that change is necessary if we want to rebuild the trust that has been damaged." As Brian left the office, he felt the full weight of his actions crashing down around him. The reality of the situation loomed large, and the journey ahead was uncertain. But within that uncertainty lay the possibility of redemption, the chance to confront his biases and become the officer he had always aspired to be. As Brian Harkins left Captain Bennett's office, a whirlwind of thoughts flooded his mind. The door clicked shut behind him, severing the connection to the tense atmosphere within. He leaned against the wall for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on his shoulders, and the full implications of his actions began to settle in. He felt a profound sense of shame wash over him, mixed with a desperate urge to justify what he had done. For over 2 decades, Brian had prided himself on being a dedicated officer, someone who protected and served his community. Yet now, he stood on shaky ground, questioning everything he had believed about himself and his role in law enforcement. In the quiet of the precinct hallway, he reflected on the recent confrontation, replaying every moment in his mind. How had he let his biases cloud his judgment? Why had he been so quick to assume that Marcus Davis, a black man simply reading in a park, posed a threat? He recalled the steady, unwavering gaze of Marcus, the calm demeanor that unnerved him during their initial encounter. Instead of viewing Marcus as a fellow human being, he had let fear and prejudice guide his actions. The realization gnawed at him, a bitter truth he couldn't escape. He had allowed stereotypes to dictate his behavior, casting aside the training he had received that emphasized community relations and understanding. Brian's shame morphed into a desire to defend his actions, but he quickly dismissed that instinct. Deep down, he knew he had made a grievous error. The voices of the community echoed in his mind, reminding him of the countless individuals who had suffered because of officers who had chosen to overlook their humanity. His actions hadn't just harmed Marcus. They had implications that rippled through the community, deepening the divide between law enforcement and the very people they were meant to protect. As he walked through the precinct, he overheard conversations among his colleagues. Some officers spoke in hushed tones, expressing their disbelief over the incident. "What was he thinking?" one remarked. "You can't just arrest someone because they don't look right." Another officer defended Brian, insisting that he was just doing his job, indicating a reluctance to confront the underlying biases that had fueled the confrontation. These varied perspectives frustrated Brian. He had expected more from his peers, an acknowledgement of the deeper issues at play. Instead, he sensed resistance to change, an unwillingness to confront the systemic problems that had long plagued their department. It was disheartening to realize that many of his colleagues were more concerned about protecting their own than about addressing the very real impact of their actions on the community. Meanwhile, the weight of accountability pressed down on him. He thought about the upcoming investigation and the ramifications it could have for his career. The fear of losing his job hung over him like a dark cloud, but he also recognized that this was not just about him, it was about the larger system of law enforcement. If he truly wanted to make a difference, he needed to confront his biases and become part of the solution, not the problem. As the focus shifted to Marcus Davis, his resolve hardened in the aftermath of the confrontation. He had never imagined that a day spent reading in the park would lead to such a significant moment in his life, yet here he was, compelled to advocate for change. The events of the day had opened his eyes to the deep-seated issues within law enforcement, and he felt a renewed commitment to ensure that the experiences of marginalized individuals were acknowledged and addressed. Marcus reflected on his own journey and the power dynamics that often left people like him feeling voiceless. He had experienced the effects of systemic racism throughout his life, but now he was determined to use his position as an FBI agent to challenge those injustices. He understood that true change required not only accountability for individuals like Brian, but also a broader cultural shift within the police department. In conversations with community leaders and fellow advocates, Marcus began to formulate a plan for action. He envisioned workshops and training sessions focused on understanding bias and promoting empathy among officers. He wanted to create a space where officers could confront their own prejudices and learn to engage with the community in a more meaningful way. Change is possible, Marcus would tell anyone willing to listen. But it starts with acknowledging the problem and being willing to have uncomfortable conversations. His commitment to advocating for marginalized voices fueled his determination to ensure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. As he moved forward, Marcus found strength in solidarity. He connected with other advocates and community members who shared his vision for a more just and equitable system. Together, they began to craft a narrative that challenged the status quo, emphasizing the importance of accountability and the need for systemic reform. In the days that followed, both Brian and Marcus found themselves at critical junctures in their lives. For Brian, it was a moment of reckoning, an opportunity to confront his biases and learn from his mistakes. For Marcus, it was a chance to be a catalyst for change, ensuring that the experiences of individuals like him would no longer be dismissed or overlooked. Their journeys, though separate, were now intertwined in a shared quest for justice and understanding within the community. In the wake of the incident involving Officer Brian Harkins and Marcus Davis, Captain Laura Bennett felt a renewed sense of purpose in her role as a leader within the precinct. Determined to prevent similar occurrences in the future, She began devising a comprehensive plan for reform that would address the systemic issues plaguing law enforcement practices. Bennett convened a series of meetings with her command staff to outline the steps necessary for implementing systemic changes in the precinct. The discussions revolved around revising the training programs to include a more robust curriculum focused on racial bias education, de-escalation techniques, and community engagement. Bennett emphasized that officers needed to recognize their inherent biases and understand how those biases could affect their interactions with the community. "We can't just talk about change. We need actionable steps," Bennett asserted during one meeting. "It's not enough to tell officers to be better. We have to provide them with the tools and knowledge to actually make those changes." The team explored partnerships with organizations specializing in racial equity training, aiming to integrate their expertise into the precinct's training regimen. Bennett was clear that these changes were not merely a response to the recent events, but part of a long-term commitment to creating a more equitable and just law enforcement culture. Recognizing that trust had to be rebuilt from the ground up, Bennett also sought to engage with community leaders and activists. She organized a series of town hall meetings, inviting local residents to voice their concerns and share their experiences with law enforcement. These forums provided a platform for open dialogue, allowing community members to express their feelings of mistrust and fear while also sharing their hopes for a better relationship with the police. Marcus Davis emerged as a powerful advocate during these discussions. His presence carried weight, and he quickly became a bridge between the police department and the community. Drawing on his experiences and insights, Marcus articulated the need for accountability and transparency. "This isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern that affects lives every day," he told attendees at a community meeting. "We need to work together to create solutions that are meaningful and lasting." Marcus encouraged community members to share their stories, highlighting the importance of lived experiences in shaping the reforms being proposed. His advocacy became a catalyst for change, inspiring others to step forward and participate in the dialogue. "We're all in this together," Marcus reminded the audience, urging them to take an active role in shaping the future of their community. As Bennett and Marcus worked tirelessly to implement these reforms, they faced significant challenges in rebuilding trust. Many community members remained skeptical, their faith in law enforcement shattered by years of negative experiences. Bennett understood that transparency and accountability were paramount to restoring that trust. To foster this transparency, she committed to regular updates on the progress of the reform initiatives, ensuring the community was informed about changes being made within the precinct. She also initiated a community advisory board that included local leaders, activists, and residents, providing them a direct line to the police department. This board would review policies, offer recommendations, and hold the department accountable for its actions. In one town hall meeting, Bennett invited community members to share their stories with the police. "We need to hear from you," she said earnestly. "Your experiences matter, and they will shape the way we move forward." As residents recounted their encounters with law enforcement, some positive, many negative, the room filled with a palpable tension. Each story highlighted the urgent need for reform and the complexities involved in rebuilding relationships. The testimonials were raw and emotional. A local mother shared her fear for her son, a young black man navigating the streets. "Every time he leaves the house, I worry," she confessed. "I shouldn't have to live in fear of the people meant to protect us." Another resident spoke about the hostility he faced during a routine traffic stop, describing how the encounter left him feeling dehumanized. Bennett listened intently, taking notes and absorbing the feedback. Each story resonated deeply with her, reinforcing the need for systemic change within the precinct. She understood that the road ahead would be difficult, marked by resistance from some officers and skepticism from the community. Yet, with Marcus by her side and a growing coalition of community advocates, Bennett remained committed to forging a new path, one rooted in understanding, accountability, and justice for all. As they left the town hall meeting that night, Marcus turned to Bennett and said, "It's going to take time, but I believe we can make a difference. People are ready for change." Bennett nodded in agreement, her heart buoyed by the hope and determination that filled the room. Together, They were laying the foundation for a new era of policing, one that recognized the humanity of every individual and aimed to heal the rift between law enforcement and the community it served. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over Riverside Park, a profound sense of transformation lingered in the air. The precinct had undergone significant changes, fueled by Marcus Davis's relentless advocacy for reform. His involvement had not only brought attention to the systemic issues plaguing law enforcement, but had also ignited a spark of change within the officers themselves. Captain Laura Bennett had led the charge in revising training programs, incorporating racial bias education and community engagement, which began to resonate with many of her colleagues. Gone were the days when officers approached their duties with an unexamined assumption of superiority. Now, they were encouraged to confront their biases head-on, engaging in open discussions about their prejudices and how those biases impacted their interactions with the community. There was a palpable shift in attitudes as officers began to recognize that understanding and empathy were essential components of effective policing. They were learning that their actions had consequences that extended far beyond the badge they wore, and they were beginning to embrace a new identity, one rooted in service and respect for the communities they served. As the precinct made strides toward becoming a more just and equitable institution, it also served as a call to action for the broader community. Readers and residents alike were encouraged to reflect on their own experiences and perceptions of law enforcement. What biases had they unknowingly harbored? How had their interactions with police shaped their views? The journey toward justice required collective effort, and each individual's voice mattered in the ongoing dialogue about race, power, and accountability. In this light, it was imperative for everyone to recognize the importance of empathy and understanding in shaping a more just society. Conversations about race and policing could no longer be relegated to whispers. They needed to be addressed openly and honestly. Each person was invited to take part in the conversation, to share their stories and listen to others. By doing so, they could contribute to a culture of accountability, ensuring that the missteps of the past would not be repeated. Looking forward, there was an undeniable sense of hope. The groundwork had been laid for continued progress, but the path ahead was still fraught with challenges. There would be resistance, setbacks, and moments of frustration. Yet, with each small victory, the vision of a more just and equitable society came closer to fruition. Marcus's journey was just one example of how individual determination could catalyze change. His commitment to advocating for the marginalized served as a beacon of inspiration, demonstrating that transformation is possible when individuals unite for a common cause. As the community moved forward together, it became increasingly clear that progress was not merely a destination but a continuous journey. Each step taken toward dismantling prejudice and injustice was a step toward a brighter future, where understanding and compassion would guide interactions between law enforcement and the communities they serve. This new beginning was a testament to the power of collective action and the unyielding belief that change is not only necessary but achievable. Together, they would continue to forge a path toward a more equitable and just society, ensuring that the lessons learned would shape a better tomorrow for all.